They said I had lost my mind right along with my husband, that a woman alone, with a 14-year-old daughter and $12 to her name, buying a crumbling stone ranger station at the dead end of a hollow in Harlan County, deserved nothing but pity or maybe contempt. The neighbors laughed, not the cruel kind of laughter, the worst kind. The kind that comes from watching someone make a mistake so obvious it barely needs explaining. A widow, a girl, $12, and a ruin that even the coal company had written off as worthless. But I knew something they didn't know yet. I knew that ruins keep what the living are too afraid to look for, that walls built from stone outlast walls built from money, and that the man who murdered my husband, the same man who owned the mines, the sheriff, the church pews, and every last deed in that valley, had made one single mistake in 20 years of perfect crime. He sold me the place where he buried his secrets. This is the story of how 12 silver dollars brought down the most powerful man in Harlan County. How a daughter who was still a child learned to fight like a woman grown. And how the neighbors who laughed in October were knocking on my door by spring because the storms had come and these old stone walls were the only thing left standing. They said I had lost my mind right along with my husband, that a woman alone with a 14-year-old daughter and $12 to her name, buying a crumbling stone ranger station at the dead end of a hollow in Harlan County, deserved nothing but pity or maybe contempt. The neighbors laughed, not the cruel kind of laughter, the worst kind. The kind that comes from watching someone make a mistake so obvious it barely needs explaining. A widow, a girl, $12, and a ruin that even the coal company had written off as worthless. But I knew something they didn't know yet. I knew that ruins keep what the living are too afraid to look for, that walls built from stone outlast walls built from money, and that the man who murdered my husband, the same man who owned the mines, the sheriff, the church pews, and every last deed in that valley, had made one single mistake in 20 years of perfect crime. He sold me the place where he buried his secrets. The Braddock Hollow Coal Camp in October of 1931 smelled like wet ash and fear. Lenora Ashwick knew it before she opened her eyes that morning, before the gray light of an Appalachian dawn crept through the cracks of the company house, where she and her daughter Clementine slept on a mattress stuffed with corn husks. She knew it because fear had its own smell in coal country, dense and ancient, like damp timber rotting from within, and it had lived in her chest for 4 weeks now, ever since the night the mine whistle blew, 3 short blasts and 1 long, which was the signal for a collapse, and the foreman came to her door with his hat in his hands and his eyes looking somewhere past her shoulder, the way men look when they carry news that will rearrange a woman's life into a before and an after. 4 weeks since they buried Declan. The burial had been quick the way company funerals always were in Harlan County. Quick and cheap, unforgettable, because dead miners were a line item, not a tragedy. 3 neighbors came. The company preacher, Reverend Sills, who looked sideways the entire time because Aldrich Braddock paid his salary, and Braddock did not care for funerals that lasted longer than the time it took to fill a hole. And Clementine, who was 14 years old and who had learned in those first terrible hours a lesson that most adults spend decades learning, that you do not cry where the powerful can see you. Declan Ashwick had been a coal miner of the common kind, not a foreman, not a union man with connections, not a company favorite with pull at the commissary. He was a man who went into the mountain before dawn and came out after dark 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year, and who was paid, not in American currency, but in Braddock's script tin coins stamped with the company seal that could only be spent at the company store, where a pound of flour cost 3 times what it cost in any free town within 50 miles. He had died in what the company report called a localized structural failure in shaft number 7, which was what men in offices called it when section of tunnel collapses on a single miner while the men working 10 yards on either side walk out without a scratch, 3 miners survived that shift. None of them talked. They didn't talk then. They didn't talk at the funeral. They didn't talk in the weeks that followed when Lenora went to each of their homes and stood at their doors and asked them plainly and without accusation what they had seen. Fear has that particular virtue among the poor. It makes them mute with an efficiency that no company boss achieves with contracts or threats. The silence of frightened men is absolute and self-sustaining. It feeds on itself. Each man's silence confirms the next man's decision to stay quiet until the silence becomes so thick and so old that breaking it feels not like courage but like madness. Lenora knew the truth because Declan had told her. 15 days before he died, he had come home with the face of a man carrying a secret too heavy for a single body. He sat by the stove in their 2-room company house, looked at his wife across the dim light of a kerosene lamp, and spoke in a voice so low it was almost swallowed by the sound of rain on the tin roof. He had seen something. The Braddock Coal Company operated like all company operations in Harlan County on a system that was designed from the ground up to keep working men in permanent debt. You were hired, you were given a company house rent deducted from your wages before you ever saw them. You were paid in scrip, not dollars. You bought your food, your tools, your lamp oil, your blasting caps, and your clothing from the company store at prices set by the company with no competition, allowed within 10 miles because Braddock owned the roads and the sheriff and the judge, who would hear any complaint you might think about filing. But Declan had seen something beyond the ordinary machinery of exploitation. He had been sent to deliver a load of timber props to the storage building behind Braddock's private office, the brick building on the hill that miners called the counting house, though none of them had ever been inside. The door had been propped open because of the heat, and Declan, passing with his load, had seen through the doorway into the back room. Aldrich Braddock himself was there, seated at a desk covered with ledgers. Beside him sat a man Declan recognized, Wallace Greer, the county clerk, who was supposed to be an officer of the public trust, but who arrived at the counting house every Tuesday evening in a car that Braddock's driver brought around to the side entrance. The two men were comparing 2 sets of books. One set, the public ledger, showed miners' wages, deductions, and balances. The other set, which Braddock kept in a locked drawer that was open that night, showed the real numbers. The difference between the 2 sets of books was not small. It was not a matter of pennies skimmed or decimal points moved. It was systematic and it was vast and it went back years. Miners who had paid off their company debts were still listed as owing. Families who had been evicted for non-payment had in fact overpaid by hundreds of dollars. Land deeds that had been seized for unpaid company store bills had been seized from men and women who owed nothing. Declan told Lenora this with the careful precision of a man who knows that what he is saying may cost him his life. He described the 2 sets of books. He described the county clerk's face in the lamplight. He described the stack of property deeds on the desk, tied with string, each one representing a family that had lost its land, its home, its future to a debt that did not exist. Lenora listened, and when he finished, she said the thing that wives have said to husbands since the beginning of human trouble. Don't tell anyone. He couldn't keep quiet. Declan Ashwick was that kind of man, the kind who had survived the trenches of the Argonne Forest in 1918, not because he was lucky or careful, but because he was stubborn in a way that made luck irrelevant, the kind who believed that a wrong witnessed and not reported was a wrong committed twice. He had carried wounded men through mustard gas in France. He had stood upright when smarter men stayed flat, and he would not sit at his own table and eat food bought with scrip from a store that was robbing every family in the hollow, knowing what he knew and say nothing. He spoke to a man he trusted, a fellow miner named Garrett, who had fought beside him in France. Garrett listened when pale and said he would think about it. 2 weeks later, shaft number 7 collapsed on Declan Ashwick while Garrett and two others walked out alive. The company report said structural failure. The county coroner, who was appointed by a judge, who was appointed by a board that Aldrich Braddock chaired, signed the death certificate without visiting the mine. Cause of death accidental, case closed, file archived. Another dead miner in Harlan County, which in 1931 was a thing so common it barely made the back page of the county newspaper, which Braddock also owned. Lenora had tried in the first weeks of widowhood the things that any woman in her position would try. She went to Reverend Sills at the company church. He spoke to her about God's mysterious plan with the fluency of a man who has repeated empty words so many times he no longer hears them. She went to the foreman of shaft number 7 who would not open his door. She went to the Women's Auxiliary of the Miners' Benevolent Society, whose chairwoman, a decent woman named Ruth, looked at the floor and said she was sorry, truly sorry, but she had children of her own, and surely Lenora understood, and she would pray. The company system had rules as old as the mountains, and among those rules was one that Lenora had known since childhood because her own mother had known it and her mother before her. The poor widow was not a person with rights. She was a problem to be managed. She would be sent to the county poorhouse or married off in haste to whoever would take her with whatever scraps of property she still held, or she would slide by degrees into a kind of servitude that had no chains but needed none, because hunger and cold and the terror of homelessness did the work of iron just fine. Lenora had 12 silver dollars and a 14-year-old daughter. The $12 were real currency, not scrip. Declan had hidden them in a tobacco tin beneath a loose floorboard in the kitchen, money saved over years from the rare occasions when company payment came in actual United States coin. A secret fund, an escape hatch, 12 rounds of ammunition against the world that had decided she was finished. And there was Stone Hollow. The Stone Hollow Ranger Station sat 4 miles upstream from the coal camp, where Crooks Creek made a sharp bend through a stand of old-growth hickory, and the road, such as it was, petered out into a footpath that led nowhere useful. It had been built in 1887 by the U.S. Forest Service during a brief period when the federal government pretended to care about Appalachian timber conservation. 4 walls of native limestone, each one 18 inches thick, a watchtower with a collapsed roof, a courtyard with a stone well, and a small prayer room built against the north wall with a rose window of carved stone that was choked with trumpet vine and had not seen sunlight in 20 years. The Braddock Coal Company had acquired it 7 years earlier when the Forest Service abandoned the station and the county auctioned the property for back taxes. Braddock's people bought it for $11 and listed it on the company books as an asset of negligible value. It was too far from the main road to be useful as a storage facility, too deteriorated to be worth the cost of repair, too small to serve any operational purpose. It sat on the company ledger like a forgotten sentence in a book no one reads. Technically, they're functionally invisible. When Lenora walked into the company office and asked to buy it, she did not go to Wallace Greer, the corrupt county clerk. She did not go to Braddock's personal secretary, a man named Stroud, who had eyes like a lizard and the moral compass of a cash register. She went to the assistant clerk, a boy of 16 named Wilton, who had been on the job for 3 months and had not yet learned to look the other way. She put 12 silver dollars on the counter and asked to purchase the Stone Hollow Ranger Station. Wilton looked at the money, looked at her, went into the back room to ask his superior, came back with the expression of someone who doesn't understand what just happened. The boss said yes. 12 silver dollars for a ruin that served no purpose was a reasonable trade for both parties as far as Braddock's people could see. The company shed a useless asset from its books, and the crazy widow bought 4 walls in which to freeze to death. The paperwork was drawn up, Lenora signed, the deed was transferred, the neighbors laughed. It was the kind of laughter that needs no explanation. The laughter of people watching someone walk off a cliff in broad daylight. A woman alone. A girl of 14, $12 gone. A stone ruin at the dead end of a hollow near an abandoned prayer room that nobody visited anymore, where the creek made an ugly bend through the hickory trees and the mud piled up in the rainy months and the road didn't go anywhere. Clementine did not laugh. She was 14, but she had been learning things in the past 4 weeks that most adults take decades to learn. She picked up their bundle. One bundle each was all they had helped. Her mother tied the other one and walked beside her without speaking for the 3-hour journey from the coal camp to the ruin along the creek path through the hickory grove where the October leaves were already brown and falling past the last company house where old Mrs. Denton watched them go from her porch without waving. When they reached the door of the ranger station, a heavy oak door hanging from a single hinge, with the rusted dignity of something that was once powerful and has forgotten it, Lenora stopped. She looked at the four walls. She looked at the tower. She looked at the small prayer room attached to the north wall with its carved rose window blinded by vines. She looked at her daughter. Here is where we begin. She did not say it with hope. She said it with the voice of someone establishing a fact. A stone dropped into still water, a boundary marked, not a wish, a declaration. Inside the walls, among the leaf rot and silence of 2 decades of abandonment, something waited. Lenora did not know it yet, but the cold of the hollow pushed her forward and she went in. Fear has its own architecture, and the architecture of Lenora Ashwick's fear in those first nights within the walls of Stone Hollow was the architecture of someone who waits for something to fall on her from above. The roof of the main room had given way in 3 places. The oak beams, which in another time had held the weight of a functioning government outpost, and whatever secrets government men keep, were rotten at the ends but solid in the middle, like a promise that was mostly kept. The first night they slept in the northeast corner, the only spot where the roof was not actively threatening to collapse on the blankets they had brought. The stone fireplace, ancient and soot-blackened, still drew air when Lenora lit a fire with hickory bark and dry leaves. The smoke went up instead of out, which was the first small mercy in weeks, and the warmth spread into the stone walls and held there with a patience that wood walls never have. Clementine did not sleep. Lenora knew this because she was awake herself most of the night listening. A hollow in Harlan County in October has its own sounds, the creek running over stones with a voice like something muttering to itself, the wind moving through the hickory grove with a long cold sigh, the owls that lived in the broken tower and who protested the intrusion for hours with the offended dignity of tenants who have not been given proper notice. And among those natural sounds, another that was not natural, an engine. The low rumble of a truck engine on the creek road close to midnight. Lenora killed the fire with handfuls of dirt and grabbed Clementine's arm in the darkness. They lay flat, silent, breathing into the wool of their blankets to muffle the sound. The engine stopped somewhere near the outer wall. A door opened and closed, footsteps, heavy boots on gravel, then on the stone of the courtyard. The footsteps circled the building slowly, methodically, the way a man walks when he is checking a property he considers his own. They stopped outside the door of the main room, a pause, long enough for Lenora to feel her heartbeat in her teeth. Then the footsteps retreated, crossed the courtyard. The truck door opened and closed again. The engine started and moved away north toward the coal camp until the sound dissolved into the general noise of the creek and the wind. They did not come back that night. But at dawn, when Lenora stepped into the courtyard with the gray light filtering through the hickory canopy, she found on the ground in front of the main door a fresh mark in the mud, the print of a heavy leather boot with a distinctive heel pattern, and beside it dropped, as if by carelessness, a length of hemp rope. It was not a forgotten rope, it was a message. Lenora picked it up, coiled it, and set it on the shelf inside the door. Then she went to work. Despite the fear, and the fear was constant, a companion that sat on her chest like a stone, Lenora spent that morning doing what needed to be done, sweeping the habitable space with brooms made from elderberry branches, plugging the smaller gaps in the roof with rags and mud, hauling water from the courtyard well, which worked. The bucket came up full of water that smelled of minerals and iron but was clean and cold and drinkable. In the old storage room behind a door that gave way on the second push, she found supplies that previous occupants had left behind, whether the Forest Service men of the 1880s or someone else who had used this place in the years between. A sack of grain, half rotten but with the core still edible, a sealed clay jar of salt, an iron meat hook that could hang from the ceiling beam and which also served, Lenora noted with the practical eye of a woman whose options were limited, as a weapon of circumstance. Clementine explores your prayer room. She came back with the face of someone who has seen something she doesn't know how to name. Mama, there's a door. It was not the main door of the prayer room, which was visible and blocked by a curtain of ivy thick as a man's wrist. It was an opening in the floor in the southwest corner of the small sacred space, hidden under a flat stone that someone had covered with loose dirt and dry branches. The covering was deliberate. Someone had meant for this to stay hidden. The stone was too heavy for the girl to move alone, but together, using the iron meat hook as a lever, they shifted it. Beneath was a stairway cut into the limestone, descending into darkness. Lenora did not go down that afternoon. The fear was too fresh. The footsteps of the night before were too recent. The memory of the rope left at her door was too clear in its meaning. They covered the stone again and placed the broken wooden bench from the prayer room on top of it. That night, Lenora slept with the iron hook beside her hand and the bread knife inside her boot. The fear did not leave, but it did not drive her out either. That was all she needed for now. On the third day, Clementine went to the closest settlement across roads, with a general store and a post office that served the scattered farms uphill from the coal camp, to trade the last skein of yarn they had brought for salt and cornmeal. While she waited at the counter, she heard something not meant for her. Two men in dark coats talking by the pot-bellied stove. She recognized neither of them, but she recognized the type company men, not miners, with clean boots, and the particular posture of men who carry authority borrowed from someone more powerful. They spoke in the low tones of men who assume that a 14-year-old girl at a store counter is furniture. She heard the name Aldrich Braddock, she heard the name Stone Hollow, and she heard one complete sentence delivered with the flatness of an order being repeated rather than given. Nobody goes near that cellar. Orders are clear. Clementine bought her salt. She did not look at the men. She walked out of the store with the careful pace of someone who has not heard anything and turned up the creek path towards Stone Hollow, trotting. Once she was out of sight, her breath making small white clouds in the October air. When she reached the ranger station door and found it barred from inside, the heavy timber crossbar that Lenora had installed on the second day, she knocked 3 times, the signal they had agreed on. Lenora opened. Clementine entered. And only then, with the bar in place and the empty courtyard between them and the world, did the girl tell her mother what she had heard. There was a silence. The kind of silence that fills a room the way water fills a bowl, evenly and completely, leaving no space for anything else. They know there's something down there, Lenora said quietly. And they know we bought this place without knowing it, Clementine said. The two of them looked at each other in the half-dark of the main room. The small fire cast long shadows on the stone walls, and in those shadows the carved initials of the Forest Servicemen from 1887, WHP and JRM, and others seemed to shift slightly, as though the men who had carved them were leaning in to listen. Someone was here before us, Lenora thought, and what they left behind matters to powerful men. The anger arrived slowly, the way fever arrives on rainy days without announcement, without a clear moment of onset, accumulating in the hours of labor and cold until one morning, Lenora found herself patching the roof of the main room with hands bleeding from hay and rusted nails, and instead of stopping, she gripped harder and kept going. She had been at Stone Hollow for 10 days. She had learned more about emergency construction in those 10 days than in the 10 years before. How to seal a roof gap with mud and straw mixed in the right proportion. Too much straw and it crumbles, too much mud and it cracks when it dries. How to test the soundness of a beam by rapping it with your knuckles and listening for the dull thud that means rot versus the solid knock that means strength. How to clear a chimney flue without collapsing the firebox. How to bank a fire so it lasts through the night without burning the building down. Clementine had developed a particular skill for selecting hickory wood from the grove between the station and the creek, slow-burning wood that gave steady heat for hours. The girl had an eye for it, the way some people have an ear for music. She could look at a fallen branch and tell by the color of the bark and the weight in her hand whether it would burn hot and fast or slow and warm. The ranger station, which to the neighbors in the coal camp was a ruin without value, a pile of stones where a crazy widow had gone to die, had qualities that only someone who lived inside it could appreciate. The limestone walls, 18 inches thick, held heat with an efficiency that no wooden cabin in Harlan County could match. Once the stones warmed from the fire, they radiated that warmth for hours after the flames died. The courtyard well produced clean cold water with absolute reliability, fed by an underground spring that had been flowing since before anyone put a name on these mountains. And the prayer room, once Clementine had cleared the ivy from the rose window and swept the floor and scrubbed the stone altar with creek water and sand, turned out to be a small but solid space with good southern light and walls so thick that the wind outside was reduced to a whisper. Stone Hollow was not a ruin, it was a fortress. And Lenora was beginning to understand why someone, perhaps Simon Montrose himself, perhaps someone else, had chosen this place to hide what could not be hidden anywhere else. The anger was not new. What was new was that Lenora had stopped apologizing for it. During the first weeks after Declan's death, the anger had been mixed with guilt. Guilt for not protecting him, guilt for not insisting harder that he stay silent, guilt for being alive when he was not. The guilt was a heavy thing, heavier than grief, because grief, at least, is honest. It says, I have lost something I loved. Guilt says I should have done something differently, and that is a sentence with no end to it, a corridor with no door at the end, a debt that cannot be paid because the creditor is dead. Now, in the hours of physical labor and cold and solitude, the guilt had burned itself out like a small candle, and what remained was the anger without mixture, pure and cold and useful. Anger for Declan, who was a just man and who was dead. Anger for the 3 miners who had survived that shift and who would not speak. Anger for Reverend Sills with his empty words and his company salary. Anger for Ruth from the women's auxiliary who was sorry and who prayed and who did nothing. Anger for Wallace Greer, the county clerk, who had sat in Braddock's office comparing 2 sets of books while families lost their land. And anger most of all for Aldrich Braddock himself, who had ordered the death of her husband with the same indifference with which a man signs a purchase order. Aldrich Braddock was not a villain from a storybook. He was something more dangerous, a man who believed he was a benefactor. He had built the company church. He had funded the county school. He had donated the land for the miners' cemetery, which was a gesture so perfectly calibrated in its cruelty that Lenora sometimes wondered if he had done it on purpose or whether that kind of evil simply generates its own ironies without effort. He was 55 years old, silver-haired, square-jawed, with the handshake of a man who has learned that physical warmth is the cheapest and most effective form of dishonesty. The miners called him Mr. B. The county newspaper called him a pillar of the community. The governor of Kentucky had dined at his house. And he had killed Declan Ashwick as casually as a man swats a fly. It was the anger that made Lenora go down into the cellar. On the 11th day, with a torch made from a rag soaked in pine resin and lashed to a hickory stick, Lenora and Clementine moved the stone again and descended. The stairway went down 9 steps into a chamber roughly 12 feet by 12, cut into the limestone bedrock of the hollow. The air was cold and still, and smelled of old earth and something else, a faint trace of incense so ancient it had almost lost its name, a ghost of worship from when the prayer room above had been a living place of faith. The torchlight found the floor first flat stone, clean as if someone had swept it not too many decades ago. Then the walls, into which 6 niches had been cut, 4 were empty. One held a dark wooden box with brass hinges gone green with age. The last held an object wrapped in yellowed linen cloth. Clementine stayed at the base of the stairs, holding the torch. Lenora opened the wooden box. Inside were documents, parchment rolls tied with leather cord. Beneath them, folded papers with broken wax seals bearing an insignia that Lenora did not recognize, a mountain over crossed peaks, which was the mark of the Montrose family, the original landowners of this stretch of the hollow before Braddock had ever set foot in Harlan County. She took the first document carefully, unrolled it, and held it to the light. It took time to read because the handwriting was legal script from the turn of the century, dense and formal. But Lenora had learned to read at the church school in her hometown before she married Declan, and the anger made her patient. What she read made her hold still for several seconds. It was a property deed, lands in the hollow and the ridges above it, including mineral rights, timber rights, water rights, and the right of way on the county road that ran from the creek ford to the railroad junction 6 miles south. Owner, the Montrose family, date 1896. Beside it was another document more recent with a different hand and a seal that Lenora recognized immediately because she had seen it on the eviction notice that Sheriff Keel had delivered to her 4 weeks ago. The seal of the Braddock Coal Company. It was a deed of transfer signed in 1911 by one Simon Montrose, surrendering all family properties to Aldrich Braddock in payment of debts. But next to that deed was a third document, unsigned, unwitnessed, written in a different hand, shaky and irregular, the handwriting of an old man writing in haste or in fear or in both. It began with the words that Lenora read 3 times before she believed them. I write this down because if I do not, I will die carrying this weight on my soul. It was the confession of Simon Montrose. Lenora sat on the floor of the cellar and read slowly while the torch crackled above, and Clementine stood silent at the stairs with the patience of someone who has learned to wait. The story was old and dirty and familiar in its structure. Simon Montrose had been forced to sign the transfer of his properties under coercion. Not the direct threat of violence, but something more refined and more effective, something that a rich coal operator with good lawyers and connections to the county seat could do better than any hired thug. Braddock had fabricated debts. He had bribed Wallace Greer, the county clerk, to certify obligations that did not exist. He had pressured the board of deacons at the First Methodist Church, where old Montrose was a lifelong member and a man of deep faith, to threaten him with expulsion from the congregation. Simon Montrose, who would rather lose his land than lose his place in the community of believers, had signed the deed. But before he disappeared into the county poorhouse, where he died 3 years later, he had hidden something. Along with the property deeds and his written confession, he had left evidence. A list of other families to whom Braddock had done the same thing over the course of 2 decades, names, dates, amounts, and in some cases the names of witnesses. 17 families, 17 transfers, 17 fabricated deaths, 20 years of systematic theft documented in the careful handwriting of a man who knew he was writing his own epitaph. And in the sixth niche, when Lenore approached it and unwrapped the linen cloth with hands that trembled not from cold but from the weight of understanding, she found 3 silver communion vessels bearing the engraved seal of the First Methodist Church of Braddock Hollow, the same vessels that Declan had seen in Braddock's office. The same vessels that had disappeared from the church sacristy 8 years ago in circumstances that the board of deacons had investigated and then quietly dropped because the investigation led to the door of the man who paid for the church roof and the preacher's salary and the Christmas fund for minors' children. They were here, in a cellar beneath a prayer room in a ranger station that Braddock had sold to a widow for $12 because he thought it was worthless. But someone else had known they were here. The boot prints at the door, the men in dark coats at the store. The sentence Clementine had overheard, "Nobody goes near that cellar." Someone had used this place as a hiding spot before Lenora arrived, and someone perhaps recently, perhaps only weeks ago, had known what was down here and had been keeping it hidden or keeping it guarded or both. Lenora climbed out of the cellar with the documents beneath her coat, and the anger transformed into something colder and more useful. Braddock knew the cellar existed. He did not know that Lenora knew. And Lenora now held in her hands the evidence of 20 years of systematic fraud, fabricated debts, stolen property, and a list of victims that included the family of her dead husband's people. The question was what to do with it. She stood in the prayer room with the linen-wrapped communion vessels at her feet and the wooden box of documents under her arm, and she looked at her daughter, who was 14 years old and who looked back at her without speaking, because Clementine had learned by now that the important things do not need to be said aloud. They carried everything to the main room. They hid the documents beneath the dirt floor of the storage room, wrapped in oilcloth that Lenora had salvaged from the abandoned well covered. They left the communion vessels in the cellar in a different niche from the one where they had been found covered with loose stone. Then they sealed the cellar again and put the bench back in place. That night, while the fire burned low and the creek muttered outside and the owls in the tower complained about the smoke, Lenora lay awake and thought about what she had. She had evidence, she had names, she had dates. She had the written confession of a dead man. She had stolen church property that could be matched to the missing items in the church inventory. She had enough to ruin Aldrich Braddock 10 times over, and she had absolutely no one to tell. The sheriff was Braddock's man, the county clerk was Braddock's man, the judge was Braddock's man, the preacher was Braddock's man, the newspaper editor was Braddock's man. Every institution in Harlan County that might have heard her accusation was owned or controlled or frightened into silence by the same man she needed to accuse. She was a widow, she was poor, she was a woman in a world where women did not testify in court against men like Braddock and survive the experience. She had a daughter who depended on her for everything. She had no money, no connections, no allies, no legal standing, and no one, not one single person in the entire valley who would stand beside her and say out loud what everyone already knew in private. She had $12 silver worth of stone walls and a box of documents that could get her killed. Lenora closed her eyes. The fire cracked once and settled. Clementine's breathing was steady and deep. The girl was asleep or doing a convincing imitation of it. Outside, the creek ran its permanent, indifferent course through the hollow, the same water that had run in Simon Montrose's time and would run long after the last coal was pulled from these mountains and the last company house rotted back into the earth. Lenora did not sleep that night, but she was not afraid. The fear was there. It was always there now, dense and familiar, like a second heartbeat, but it had moved from the front of her mind to the back, from the driver's seat to the cargo bed. What sat in front now was something else, something that had no name yet, but that felt in the darkness like the first edge of a blade being sharpened on a stone. The neighbors had laughed when the widow bought Stone Hollow. They were right that it was madness, but they were wrong about everything else. The storms were coming, and these old stone walls were about to prove what they were built for. The answer to Lenora's question arrived on horseback. Not literally, it arrived in a 1924 Ford Model T with a cracked windshield and Virginia plates trailing a cloud of Appalachian dust up the creek road on the 14th day of Lenora's occupation of Stone Hollow. But the man who stepped out of it had the bearing of someone more accustomed to horses than automobiles, and the careful way he shut the door gently as though the machine might not survive rough handling suggested a man who did not take his possessions for granted. His name was Harlan Rawls. He was 35 years old, lean, in the way that men who eat irregularly are lean, with a face that had been weathered past its years by roads and weather and the particular kind of aging that comes from seeing too much of the world to be impressed by any single part of it. He wore a grey traveling coat that had been good quality 5 years ago and was now held together in places by careful stitching. His boots were worn but clean. His hat was the broad-brimmed kind favored by men who spend long hours outdoors, not a farmer's hat, not a miner's hat, something in between. He had been a newspaper reporter in Richmond, Virginia, until the paper folded in 1929 when the money dried up and the advertisers disappeared and the publisher decided that truth was a luxury that could not survive a depression. Since then, he had made his living as a traveling cloth merchant, buying fabric in the mills of Virginia and selling it in the small towns of Appalachia, which was not a profession that made a man rich, but which made him invisible, and invisibility, as Harlan Rawls had learned in both war and peace, was the most valuable currency a man could carry. He did not knock at the outer wall because the gate was open. Lenora had left it unbarred during the day now, partly because the heavy timber was difficult to move alone, and partly because she had decided with the cold logic that was replacing her fear that a barred gate during daylight told the visitor she was afraid and she could not afford to appear afraid. She was splitting firewood in the courtyard when the Model T appeared. She had the axe in her hand and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and when the stranger stepped through the gate and stopped at a respectful distance, she did not put the axe down. He looked at the woman with the axe. She looked at the man with the worn coat. The creak filled the silence between them with its permanent muttering. "I'm looking for the road to the rail junction," the man said. "They told me in the settlement that a widow was living out here." He paused. "You are the widow." It was not a question. Lenora studied him the way she had learned to study people in the past 4 weeks, quickly, thoroughly looking for the signs that told her whether a person was dangerous, useful, or simply passing through. "What do you want with the widow?" she said. Harlan Rawls reached into his coat slowly because he could see the axe and brought out an envelope. He held it up so she could see it without approaching. "I knew your husband," he said. "We served together in France. Argonne Forest, October 1918. 3rd Battalion, 328th Infantry Regiment. Your husband pulled me out of a trench on the morning of October 8th after a shell buried me under 2 feet of mud and timber. I would have died there if he hadn't come back for me. The rest of the company had already moved forward. Declan came back." Lenora said nothing, but something in her face changed, a slight loosening around the eyes, the kind of shift that happens when a person recognizes a truth being told rather than a story being performed. "I heard about his death 3 weeks ago," Harlan continued, "in a boarding house in Lexington. A man from this county was talking about the mine collapse in Braddock Hollow. He mentioned the name Declan Ashwick. I came here to find you, to see if there was anything I could do. I went to the coal camp first. They told me you had left, bought this place. He looked at the stone walls, the patched roof, the courtyard with its working well and its firewood stacked against the south wall with the careful geometry of someone who has learned that order is a weapon against chaos. Nobody said it with respect, he added. Nobody says it with respect yet, Lenora replied. Harlan nodded. Then he asked the question that changed everything. Did you find the cellar? The silence between them lasted long enough to make an answer unnecessary. They sat in the main room beside the fire. Lenora gave him water from the well. She had nothing else to offer, and he drank it slowly while he talked. Clementine sat in the corner with her knees drawn up and her eyes fixed on the stranger with the concentrated attention of someone cataloging every word for later examination. Harlan Rawls had known Simon Montrose. Not well, not as a friend or a neighbor, but as a source. In 1925, when Harlan was still a working journalist in Richmond, an old man had appeared at the newspaper office with a story about a coal company in Harlan County, Kentucky, that had been stealing land from families through fabricated debts. The old man was Simon Montrose. He had traveled 200 miles by train and bus to tell his story to someone outside the reach of Aldrich Braddock. The editor of the Richmond paper had listened, been interested, and then been advised by the paper's lawyer that pursuing a story about a coal operator in another state based on the allegations of a single elderly man with no corroborating evidence was a good way to attract a libel suit that would close the paper. The story was killed. But Harlan, who was 29 at the time and still young enough to believe that journalism meant something, had met with Montrose privately. The old man had brought copies of his documents, not the originals, which he said were hidden in a safe place, but careful duplicates made in his own hand and notarized by a public notary in Richmond who had no connection to Harlan County or to Braddock. Montrose had asked Harlan to keep the copies, to hold them, to wait for what Harlan had asked. For the right time, Montrose had said, or the right person, whichever comes first. Simon Montrose died in the county poorhouse in 1928. Harlan still had the copies. He had carried them for 6 years through 3 states and a dozen boarding houses in a leather case beneath his sample fabrics because he was a man who kept his word, and keeping his word was the only currency a traveling merchant could not afford to lose. But now there was more. Harlan had heard things in his travels through the coal fields of eastern Kentucky. The name Aldrich Braddock came up too often and in too many of the same kinds of stories. Families who lost their land to debts they swore they had paid. A county clerk who drove a car that no county clerk's salary could buy. A miner in the town of Evarts who had tried to file a complaint with the state labor board and who had been found at the bottom of a ravine with a broken neck ruled accidental by the same coroner who had ruled Declan Ashwick's death accidental. And 3 weeks ago in that boarding house in Lexington, the name Declan Ashwick, the man who had pulled Harlan out of a trench in France 13 years ago, the man to whom Harlan owed his life in the most literal and unmetaphorical sense possible. I owe your husband a debt I cannot repay, Harlan said to Lenora. He looked at the fire. I came here to see if I could pay part of it to you. Lenora listened to all of this without interruption. When Harlan finished, she asked one question. What can be done with what we have? This was the moment when a different kind of woman might have deferred, might have said, what do you think we should do, might have handed the weight of the decision to the man with the car and the contacts and the experience of the world beyond Harlan County. But Lenora Ashwick had spent the last 2 weeks learning that deference was a luxury she could not afford, and that the decisions which mattered, the ones that determined whether she and her daughter lived or died, whether they stayed or ran, whether they fought or surrendered, had to be hers. Harlan understood this. He had seen this kind of stubbornness before. He had seen it in the trenches in men who should have been dead by every rational calculation, but who kept moving forward because something inside them had decided that stopping was not an option. Declan had been that kind of man. His wife, Harlan, now realized was that kind of woman. There is a federal judge in Charleston, Harlan said, newly appointed. His name is Cornelius Fenton. He was sent from Washington to handle labor disputes in the coal fields. The governor asked for federal help because the county courts are compromised. Fenton is not Braddock's man. He has no ties to this county, no debts, no favors owed. He is, from everything I have heard, an honest man in a system that does not reward honesty. How far is Charleston? A day's drive, maybe a day and a half if we avoid the main roads, which we should. Lenora looked at the fire. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the stone walls that had stood for 44 years and that had seen more than one kind of trouble and were still standing. Harlan read her silence correctly. There is another option, he said carefully. I have contacts in Richmond, a cloth merchants' guild that owes me favors. I could take you and the girl to Virginia, set you up with a boarding house, keep you out of Braddock's reach while I take the documents to Fenton myself. It would be safer for both of you. No, she said it without hesitation, without the dramatic pause that would have suggested she was performing the decision rather than making it. I did not buy these walls to hide behind someone else's. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the way a man nods when he hears something he expected but needed to hear spoken aloud. Then we move fast, he said. In the days that followed, Lenora built her alliance. She did this herself, not Harlan, though he helped in the ways he could, and his car made distances manageable that would have been impossible on foot. But the conversations that mattered, the moments of persuasion that turned silence into speech and fear into something resembling willingness, were Lenora's. She did not ask for help directly. She had learned in those first terrible weeks of widowhood that asking frightened people for help produces reflexive refusal, the no that comes before thought, the protective instinct of people who have too much to lose. Instead, she went to be present, to be seen, to sit in the general store at the Crossroads settlement on a Wednesday morning and let people see her, the widow who had bought the stone ruin, who was less crazy than she seemed because she was still alive and had not run. On the second day of this quiet campaign, she found what she was looking for. Martha Shelton was 71 years old and lived in a one-room cabin on the ridge above the settlement on a piece of land so steep and rocky that even Braddock had not bothered to take it. She had lost her real land, 40 acres of good bottom land along the creek 17 years ago, in a debt that she swore to this day she had paid in full. The debt was owed to the company store. The receipt she had been given was declared invalid by Wallace Greer at the county clerk's office. The land was seized. Martha's husband had died of a stroke 6 months later, which Martha attributed not to natural causes but to heartbreak, and which she spoke of with the flat certainty of someone who has had 17 years to turn grief into fact. She was not on Simon Montrose's list. Her land had been taken after Montrose wrote his confession. She was a later victim outside the documented record, but she knew things. She studied Lenora for a long time before she spoke the way old women in Appalachia study younger women, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful evaluation of someone who has seen too many people make promises they cannot keep. There are more of us, Martha said at last. Her voice was low, the voice of someone speaking a truth that has been kept underground for a long time and is not sure it can survive the air. We are many, but nobody talks, because nobody lives long after talking. I am talking, Lenora said. Martha's eyes moved over Lenora's face, searching for something. Whatever she found, it satisfied her. You have something, she said, something he wants. I have the truth, written down, in his own people's hand. Another long silence. The fire in Martha's cabin popped twice. Then Martha spoke the name that changed the shape of what was possible. Pete Farley. The brother of the boy they drowned in the river 5 years ago. He lives over in Millstone Gap. He never talked. But he knows what he saw that night, and he's been carrying it like a stone in his chest ever since. It was Harlan who drove to Millstone Gap because a traveling cloth merchant driving through the hills was invisible in a way that a widow walking would not be. But it was Lenora who had told him what to say and how to say it, not as a favor, not as an obligation, as a simple statement of fact. There was evidence. Now there was a judge outside Braddock's reach, and there was a woman who was willing to stand up and speak first so that Pete Farley would not have to stand alone. Harlan came back on the second day with Pete Farley riding beside him in the Model T. Pete was 30 years old. He had the hands of a man who works the earth and the eyes of a man who has been carrying something inside his chest for 5 years that has been slowly crushing him from within. His younger brother Emmett had worked as a teamster for the Braddock Company, hauling coal from the mine to the rail junction. Emmett had discovered a discrepancy in the loading records, coal being recorded at one weight at the mine and a different weight at the junction, the difference being skimmed off and sold privately through a side operation that Braddock ran through a shell company in Lexington. Emmett had gone to the county sheriff to report what he had found. 3 days later, he was found face down in Crook's Creek with his skull cracked open. The coroner ruled it an accident, a slip on wet rocks, a fall, an unlucky landing. Pete, who had been staying with his brother that week, had seen 2 men leave Emmett's cabin at midnight. He recognized one of them, a man named Doss, who worked as Braddock's personal driver. Pete had never spoken about what he saw, not to the sheriff, not to the coroner, not to anyone, because Doss had come to Pete's farm 3 days after the funeral and sat on Pete's porch and said nothing at all for 20 minutes, just sat there cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife, and then stood up and said, "Nice place you got here, Pete," and walked away. That was all it took. 5 years of silence, 5 years of carrying the image of 2 men leaving his brother's cabin at midnight and the sound of the creek running in the dark. Pete Farley was willing to testify before a federal judge outside the jurisdiction of Harlan County if someone could guarantee the safety of his wife and 2 children during the proceedings. Harlan could offer that, not a perfect guarantee, but a practical one. He would take Pete's family to Richmond House, them with the cloth merchant's guild, keep them out of Braddock's reach until the case was resolved. The alliance now had 4 people: Lenora, who had the original documents and the anger to use them; Harlan, who had the copies and the car and the contacts; Pete, who had the eyewitness testimony; and Clementine, who had a 14-year-old's memory for detail and a handwriting so clean and precise that the copies she had been making of the Montrose documents, working by firelight each evening in case the originals were lost or destroyed, were nearly indistinguishable from the originals themselves. It was not enough. Lenora knew it was not enough. Braddock had survived 20 years by being smarter, richer, and more ruthless than anyone who had tried to challenge him. He had survived because the system was his every lever, every checkpoint, every official seal. Going to Charleston with 4 witnesses and a box of documents was not a guarantee of victory. It was a chance, a single crack in a wall that had been solid for 2 decades. But a crack is where the light gets in. On the 17th day, the men came. Not the midnight visitors with their boot prints and their rope. This time it was daylight, and the man who came was not a hired hand or a company guard. It was Aldrich Braddock himself. He arrived in a black Packard sedan driven by the man named Doss, the same Doss that Pete Farley had seen leaving Emmett's cabin at midnight 5 years ago. 2 other men followed in a second car. They pulled into the courtyard of Stone Hollow without invitation, the way men enter a place they consider their property regardless of what the deed says. Braddock stepped out of the Packard with the measured ease of a man who has spent 55 years learning that physical composure is a form of power. He was taller than Lenora had expected. She had seen him only from a distance before at company gatherings and the 4th of July picnic that the miners were required to attend. Up close, he was solid and silver-haired and had the kind of face that small-town newspapers put on the front page with the caption "Community Leader." His eyes were pale blue and very steady, the eyes of a man who has learned that a low voice is more threatening than a shout. Lenora was at the well drawing water. Harlan was inside. They had agreed that his presence should not be known to Braddock's people if it could be avoided. Clementine was in the prayer room copying documents. Braddock walked to the well, stopped 6 feet from Lenora, took off his hat, a gesture of courtesy so perfectly executed that it was almost indistinguishable from genuine respect. "Mrs. Ashwick," he said. His voice was the voice of a church deacon, of a man who serves on charity boards and speaks at Rotary dinners, warm, concerned, paternal. "I understand you've been having a difficult time. I want you to know that the company has always valued the service of its workers and their families. Your husband was a good man." He let that sentence sit in the air between them. "A good man," said with the same mouth that had ordered that good man buried in a collapsed tunnel. Lenora said nothing. She held the well rope in both hands and waited. Braddock continued. "There has been," he said, "a question raised about the sale of this property. My people have reviewed the paperwork and it appears the clerk who handled the transaction did not have the proper authority. The sale may not be valid. I've instructed my attorneys to file a petition with the county court to void the transfer and restore the property to the company." He smiled. It was a kind smile, the kind of smile that takes years of practice to perfect. The smile of a man who is offering you a last chance and wants you to know it. "I am here as a courtesy, Mrs. Ashwick. You have 3 days to vacate voluntarily. After that, the county sheriff will enforce the court order. I would prefer to resolve this quietly, for everyone's sake." A pause. The creek muttered. A hawk circled overhead with the distant patience of a creature that has all the time in the world. "The sale is documented," Lenora said. Her voice was steadier than she had expected to find it. "I have the deed, signed and witnessed by a clerk who had no authority to sell, a clerk who works in your office, who took your money and stamped your seal." Braddock studied her. Something moved behind those pale blue eyes, not anger exactly, but a recalculation. The expression of a man who has set a trap expecting a rabbit and has found instead something with teeth. "Mrs. Ashwick," he said, and his voice dropped half a register, which was the shift from paternal to something else. "I am trying to help you. You are a widow. You have a child. The mountains are no place for a woman alone in winter. There are resources, the church, the county assistance program that can help you find more suitable arrangements." "No," she said it looking directly at him, not loudly, not with drama, with the flat finality of a stone hitting the ground. Braddock held her gaze for 3 seconds, 4, 5. Then something tightened around his mouth, a muscle movement so small that most people would have missed it, but Lenora saw it because she was watching for it. It was the look of a man who is not accustomed to being refused, especially not by a woman, especially not by a widow standing next to a well in a ruin that he considered his. 3 days, he said. He put his hat back on, turned, walked to the Packard. Doss opened the door for him. The 2 cars pulled out of the courtyard, and the sound of their engines faded down the creek road until there was nothing left but the water and the wind. Harlan stepped out of the main room. He had heard everything through the window. 3 days, he said. "I know." He's not bluffing. "The county court will do whatever he says. The county court is not the only court." Harlan looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who has already made a decision and is now simply waiting for the world to catch up. The 3 days of the ultimatum passed. Lenora did not leave Stone Hollow. On the first day, Braddock's people visited 2 of the families that Martha Shelton had identified as potential witnesses, families who had lost land to fabricated debts and who might with sufficient protection be willing to testify. Both families sent word through Martha that they could not help. The messages were nearly identical. We have children, we are sorry, we understand. On the second day, a man named Crawford, a retired bookkeeper who had worked for the Braddock Company 15 years earlier, and who, according to Martha's network of whispered information, had participated in the falsification of company store records and was willing to confess in exchange for leniency, disappeared from his cabin in the settlement. He returned a week later, pale and silent, and would not answer his door. On the third day, Sheriff Cyrus Keel began making nightly patrols past Stone Hollow in his county car, driving slowly with his headlights sweeping across the wall, stopping sometimes for 10 or 15 minutes with the engine idling, doing nothing but sitting there in the dark, reminding Lenora and everyone else in the hollow that the law in Harlan County wore a badge paid for by Aldrich Braddock. On the night of the third day, they burned the woodshed. Lenora heard it before she saw it, the roar of fire consuming dry wood, a sound that is unmistakable once you have heard it, a sound that the body recognizes before the mind does. She ran to the courtyard and saw the shed she had built against the south wall fully engulfed the flames, throwing wild orange light across the stone walls and sending sparks upward into the dark October sky. Clementine was already there, stamping out embers that had landed on the dry leaves near the main building. Together they fought the fire with blankets and well water for 20 minutes until it burned itself out, because there is only so much you can do with 2 blankets and a bucket when a structure full of seasoned firewood decides to become an inferno. When the fire died and the smoke settled and the courtyard was lit only by the embers and the faint light of a quarter moon, Lenora found a stone on the ground near the gate. Wrapped around it with twine was a piece of paper. The handwriting was crude, the kind of writing done by a man who does not write often. Widows should know their place. Lenora held the paper in the light of the dying embers. Her hands did not shake. Something had happened to her hands in the past 3 weeks. They had stopped shaking the way a machine stops vibrating once it reaches a certain speed, and the tremors cancel themselves out. She was past shaking now. She was in the territory beyond shaking, where the body becomes very still and very focused, and the mind narrows to a single point of bright, cold clarity. Then Clementine spoke from beside her. "Mama, I have the copies." Lenora turned. Her daughter was standing in the doorway of the prayer room holding her coat. The coat was heavier than a coat should be, because sewn into the lining in stitches so small and tight that they were invisible unless you knew where to look, were the duplicate copies of every document from the Montrose box, every property deed, every page of the confession, every name on the list. Clementine had done this 3 days ago on her own without being asked. She had taken needle and thread and the oilcloth copies she had been making by firelight, and she had sewn them into her coat with the instinct of a child who has learned in the space of a few weeks that the things you carry on your body are the only things that cannot be taken from you while you sleep. "Pa died for knowing," Clementine said. Her voice was steady, her eyes were dry. "We won't die for telling." Lenora looked at her daughter and saw, not for the first time, but with a clarity that the firelight made sharper, that the girl standing in front of her was no longer entirely a child. Something had crossed over in Clementine during these weeks of cold and fear and labor, some threshold between childhood and whatever comes after, and she had crossed it without ceremony and without complaint, the way people cross thresholds in times of crisis, not because they choose to, but because the ground behind them has fallen away. They left that night, the 4 of them, Lenora, Clementine, Harlan, and Pete Farley, who had been staying with Martha Shelton, and who came down the ridge path at midnight with a small pack and the expression of a man who has finally decided to set down a weight he has been carrying for 5 years. They took the creek road south in Harlan's Model T, with the headlights off for the first 3 miles, navigating by moonlight and the sound of the water, because the main road north passed within sight of the company gate. where Braddock's watchman sat in a shack with a telephone connected directly to the Braddock house. Lenora drove. Harlan sat beside her with a map and a flashlight that he used sparingly, cupping the light with his hand. Clementine and Pete sat in the back with the documents, the originals wrapped in oilcloth in a feed sack between Lenora's feet, the copy sewn into Clementine's coat, and the notarized duplicates from Harlan's leather case in the compartment behind the seat. 3 copies, 3 locations, because Lenora had learned from Simon Montrose's example that evidence hidden in only one place is evidence that can be destroyed in a single act. They drove through the night on back roads that Harlan knew from his years as a traveling merchant, roads that did not appear on the county map, roads that wound through hollows and over ridges and through creek fords where the water came up to the running boards and the Model T's engine coughed and sputtered but did not die. They reached Charleston at dusk the following day, coming in from the south through the river road with the Capitol dome visible against the gray November sky and the Kanawha River running white and brown below the bridge. Harlan had arranged a room at a boarding house near the river run by a woman he knew from the cloth trade. The room was small and cold and clean, and for the first time in weeks, Lenora and Clementine slept under a roof that was not their responsibility to maintain, on a bed that someone else had made, in a building where the walls were made of brick and the doors had locks that worked. Judge Cornelius Fenton received them the following afternoon. He was 60 years old, with the lean, angular face of a man who has been sharpened by decades of legal work until everything unnecessary has been worn away. He had been appointed to the federal bench 3 months earlier by President Hoover as part of a response to the escalating violence in the Kentucky and West Virginia coal fields, mine wars, union battles, company brutality. Fenton was from Washington. He had no family in Appalachia, no investments in coal, no debts to any operator, no favors owed to any county machine. He was, in the language of the federal system, clean. He received Lenora in his chambers at the federal courthouse. Not Harlan, Lenora. She had insisted on this, and Harlan had not argued because he understood perhaps better than anyone that the story Lenora had to tell was hers, and that telling it through a man's voice, however well-intentioned, would diminish it in ways that a federal judge would detect even if he could not name them. Lenora sat across from Judge Fenton in a straight-backed chair and told him everything. She spoke for 45 minutes. She began with Declan, his service in France, his work in the mine, what he had seen in the counting house, and how he had died. She described the funeral and the eviction and the $12 silver. She described Stone Hollow and the cellar and the documents and the communion vessels. She described the boot prints and the rope and the men in dark coats and the sentence Clementine had overheard at the store. She described Braddock's visit to the well and the 3-day ultimatum and the burning of the woodshed and the note wrapped around the stone. She presented the documents one at a time, explaining each one with the clarity of a woman who had read them dozens of times by torchlight in a cellar beneath a prayer room, while the fear sat on her chest like a living thing and the anger burned clean and burned bright beneath it. Judge Fenton listened without interruption. He examined each document with the deliberate attention of a man who has seen thousands of documents in his career and who knows the difference between evidence and noise. When Lenora finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers stippled under his chin. Then he spoke. "Where are the communion vessels now?" "In the cellar at Stone Hollow," Lenora said. "I left them there. They are evidence, and I did not want to be accused of stealing them." Fenton looked at her with an expression that she would later describe to Clementine as the expression of a man who has just been reminded that intelligence does not require a title. "Mrs. Ashwick," he said, "I will open a formal inquiry. I will subpoena the company records. I will send federal marshals to secure the evidence at Stone Hollow, and I will schedule a hearing." He paused. But I want you to understand something. Alrik Braddock is a man with resources. He has lawyers, he has connections to the state capital. He will fight this with everything he has. And his first line of attack will be your credibility. I know. The laws of this state and this country are not kind to women in courtrooms. His attorneys will challenge your right to testify. They will question your motives. They will suggest that grief has made you unreliable, that a widow's accusations against a prominent citizen are the product of bitterness rather than evidence. The evidence is not bitter, Lenora said. It is documented. Fenton inclined his head slightly, the gesture of a man acknowledging a point well made. No, he said, it is not. That night in the boarding house by the river, Lenora sat by the window while Clementine slept, and the Kanawha River moved through the darkness below with its permanent indifferent sound. Harlan knocked at the door at 10 o'clock. His face told her something before his words did. Braddock's lawyers came to the boarding house where I was staying, he said. The Cloth Merchants Guild House on Capitol Street. They offered me money, enough to retire on, to forget the Montrose documents, to go back to Richmond and let this die. Lenora looked at him. I thanked them for the visit, Harlan said, and closed the door. He sat down on the chair by the window. The river moved below them, and somewhere in the courthouse, 3 blocks away, the machinery of federal law was beginning to turn slowly, as machinery always turns when the gears are old and the resistance is strong but turning. The hearing is set for Thursday, Harlan said, day after tomorrow. Lenora nodded. She turned back to the window. The lights of Charleston reflected on the river in long, broken streaks of yellow and white, and on the far bank the dark shape of the hills rose against the sky that held no stars. She was not afraid. She was past fear now, in the same way that a river is past its source. The source is still there somewhere in the mountains behind, but the water has traveled too far and gathered too much momentum to remember where it began. In 2 days she would walk into a federal courtroom and face the man who had killed her husband. She would speak his crimes aloud in a room full of strangers. She would put her name and her daughter's name and her dead husband's name on the record where Braddock's people could see them. And then the storms would come, and the walls of Stone Hollow, the walls the neighbors had laughed at, the walls that an empire of coal and corruption had written off as worthless, would show what they were made of. The morning of the hearing, Lenora dressed in the only good clothes. She owned her wedding dress, which was not white because poor women in Harlan County did not marry in white. It was dark blue cotton with a collar that Lenora had stitched herself 9 years ago in the kitchen of her mother's house the morning before she married Declan Ashwick. The dress had been washed and mended so many times that the original fabric and the patches had reached a kind of truce, a patchwork of blues that held together through stubbornness rather than thread. Clementine helped her mother with her hair. She braided it in the style of the free-born women of the hill country, not the loose style of a servant, not the pinned arrangement of a wealthy woman, but the tight, practical braid of a woman who works with her hands and does not apologize for it. It was a small thing, a thing that no one in the courtroom would notice or understand, but it mattered to Lenora the way that armor matters to a soldier, not because it stops every blow, but because putting it on is the act that separates preparation from surrender. When the braid was done, Clementine went to the corner of the room where the feed sack sat and unwrapped the oilcloth. She lifted the documents out, the original Montrose deeds, the confession, the list of names, the property transfers, and wrapped them in the linen cloth that Lenora had carried from Stone Hollow. Then she tucked the bundle under her arm. I'll carry them, she said. Lenora looked at her daughter. These are mine too, Clementine said. Pa paid for them with his life. We both found them. We both dug them out of that cellar, and I copied every word of them by firelight while you kept watch. They are ours. There was nothing to say to that. It was not an argument. It was a statement of fact delivered by a 14-year-old girl who had crossed into a territory that most adults never reach, the territory where fear and duty exist in the same body at the same time, and neither one wins. And what you do is not determined by which one is stronger, but by what kind of person you have decided to be. They walked to the courthouse together, mother and daughter. The Kanawha River ran beside them in the November morning, cold and clear, and moving with the steady indifference of water that has been running since before there were courthouses or coal companies or any human institution that presumed to call itself permanent. The federal courthouse in Charleston was a stone building with columns and high windows, and the particular smell of wax and old wood and authority that government buildings acquire over time. It smelled, Lenora thought, as she climbed the steps, like a church that worships something other than God, something colder and more procedural, but no less powerful. The hearing room was on the second floor. Judge Cornelius Fenton presided from a raised bench of dark oak. To his left sat a court clerk and a stenographer. To his right, two federal marshals in plain clothes who had been positioned there on Fenton's orders, a precaution that Lenora did not fully appreciate until later. The gallery was not empty. Word had spread the way word spreads in small cities when a powerful man is brought before a court. There were reporters from the Charleston Gazette and the Huntington Herald. There were representatives of the United Mine Workers who had been fighting Braddock's operations for years without success and who saw in this hearing something they had never had before: evidence. There were two deacons from the First Methodist Church of Braddock Hollow who had traveled overnight when they learned that the missing communion vessels had been found, and who sat in the front row of the gallery with the expressions of men who had been asked to choose between their faith and their patron, and who were discovering in real time which one they valued more. And there was Aldrich Braddock. He arrived with three attorneys. The lead attorney was Thaddeus Hale, 60 years old, white-haired, with the distinguished bearing of a man who has spent 2 decades converting legal expertise into the service of wealth. Hale had been Braddock's personal lawyer for 20 years. He had handled the property acquisitions, the company contracts, the county court filings, the labor disputes. If Braddock was the architect of the system, Hale was the engineer who had built it document by document, clause by clause, signature by signature. Braddock himself sat behind his attorneys with the expression of a man who confuses arrogance with composure. He wore a dark suit of excellent cut. His silver hair was combed back. His pale blue eyes surveyed the courtroom with the calm of someone attending a proceeding that he considers a formality and inconvenience to be managed, not a threat to be feared. He did not look at Lenora, not once, not during the opening statements, not when the clerk read the charges, not when Judge Fenton called the hearing to order and the room fell silent with the particular silence of a space where something irreversible is about to happen. The charges were read: fraud in the execution of property transfers, falsification of company records, theft of ecclesiastical property, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and one charge that made the courtroom go very quiet: accessory to the wrongful death of Declan Ashwick, miner of Braddock Hollow, Harlan County, Kentucky. Braddock's attorneys began exactly as Judge Fenton had predicted. The lead motion was to challenge Lenora's standing as a witness. Thaddeus Hale rose with the fluid ease of a man who has made this kind of argument 1,000 times and delivered his objection in a voice that was calm, reasonable, and devastating in its precision. Mrs. Ashwick, he argued, was not a competent witness. She was the widow of the deceased, an interested party with obvious motive to fabricate. She was a woman of limited education and no legal standing. Her emotional state following the traumatic loss of her husband rendered her testimony unreliable. The documents she claimed to have found were of uncertain provenance. The chain of custody was compromised. A woman living alone in an abandoned building finding documents that happened to support her accusations, the court could see how this might appear. Hale delivered this argument without cruelty. That was what made it effective. He spoke with the tone of a man who was sorry, genuinely sorry, that this poor woman had been misled by her grief into making accusations she could not support. It was a performance of compassion so polished that it might have convinced a lesser judge. Judge Fenton listened, he let Hale finish, then he ruled. The witness will be heard, he said. Under federal statute, a direct victim of alleged criminal conduct has standing to testify regardless of gender, marital status, or relationship to the accused. Mrs. Ashwick is a direct victim. Her husband died in circumstances directly related to the conduct alleged in these charges. She will testify under oath, and this court will evaluate her credibility based on the evidence she presents, not on her personal circumstances. Halley sat down. Something crossed his face, not surprise, because a lawyer of his experience is never surprised by a ruling, but something else. A shift, a recalculation, the expression of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath his feet is not as solid as he believed. Lenora took the witness chair. She sat straight, her hands were in her lap. The blue dress, with its careful patches, was visible to the entire courtroom. Clementine sat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind the witness chair, the linen bundle of documents on the bench beside her, and her eyes fixed on her mother with an expression that combined the watchfulness of a guard with the stillness of absolute trust. Lenora began to speak. Her voice trembled in the first minutes, not with uncertainty, with the particular vibration that comes from containing too much for too long, the way a dam trembles not from weakness but from the pressure of what it holds. She spoke about Declan, about the night he came home and sat by the stove and told her what he had seen, about the 2 sets of books and the county clerk at the desk and the stack of property deeds tied with string, about the 15 days between his confession and his death, about the mine whistle, 3 short blasts and 1 long, and the foreman at the door with his hat in his hands. She described the funeral, 3 neighbors, the preacher looking sideways, Clementine learning not to cry. She described the eviction, the sheriff at the door, the 7 days, the refusals, the preacher, the foreman, the women's auxiliary, the county clerk. She described the 12 silver dollars, the tobacco tin, the purchase, the laughter. She described Stone Hollow, the first night, the engine in the dark, the boot print, the rope, and then she described the cellar. She presented the documents one by one. Clementine handed each one to the court clerk, who handed it to Judge Fenton, who examined it and passed it to the stenographer for the record. The Montrose property deeds dated 1896, the transfer document dated 1911 with Braddock's seal, Simon Montrose's confession in his own hand describing 20 years of fabricated debts, bribed officials, and stolen land, the list of 17 families, the dates, the amounts, the names, and the communion vessels. 2 federal marshals had retrieved them from the cellar at Stone Hollow 2 days earlier under Judge Fenton's order. They sat on the evidence table in their linen wrappings, 3 silver cups bearing the engraved seal of the First Methodist Church of Braddock Hollow, matching exactly the description in the church's inventory of items reported missing 8 years ago. The 2 deacons in the front row identified them on sight. One of them, an old man named Prosser, who had been a deacon for 30 years, began to weep silently, which was the first sound from the gallery, and which the stenographer did not record, but which everyone present remembered. Lenora spoke for nearly 2 hours. Her voice steadied after the first 10 minutes and did not waver again. She answered every question from the bench with the precision of a woman who had read these documents so many times in the torchlight of a cellar that they had become part of her, the way scripture becomes part of a person who reads it daily, not memorized but absorbed, understood at a level below conscious thought. Then the cross-examination began. Braddock's second attorney, a younger man named Pratt Sharp and fast hired specifically for this kind of work, went after Lenora with the methodical brutality that defense attorneys in coal country had perfected over decades of protecting operators from the complaints of workers. Was it not true that Mrs. Ashwick had a personal motive to accuse Mr. Braddock? Was it not true that her grief over her husband's death, a death that the county coroner had ruled accidental, might have distorted her perception? Was it not true that the documents she claimed to have found in a cellar might have been placed there by someone else, perhaps even by Mrs. Ashwick herself, as part of a scheme to extract money from a prominent citizen? Was it not true that a woman of her background, limited education, no legal training, no experience with financial records, was not qualified to interpret the documents she was presenting? Lenora answered each question, not with emotion, not with tears, not with the trembling outrage that Pratt was trying to provoke, because a witness who loses her composure is a witness who loses her credibility. And Lenora had learned in the past 5 weeks that composure is not the absence of feeling, but the discipline of feeling, the act of keeping the fire inside the stove where it produces heat instead of letting it escape on to the floor where it produces only destruction. She answered with logic. The documents have dates and seals that can be verified by independent examination. The communion vessels match the church inventory, which was filed with the county 8 years ago, and which I had no access to and no knowledge of until the deacons confirmed the match. Simon Montrose's confession is corroborated by notarized copies made independently in Richmond, Virginia, 6 years ago by a man I had never met until 3 weeks ago. I was 7 years old and living 200 miles from Harlan County when these documents were written. I did not fabricate them, I found them in a cellar beneath a building that I purchased legally with documented funds through a transaction approved by Mr. Braddock's own office. She paused. Then she added something that was not a response to a question, but that Judge Fenton allowed because it went to the heart of the matter. And I did not come here because of grief. I came here because of evidence. Grief is what I carry. Evidence is what I brought. The courtroom was silent for 4 seconds. The stenographer's fingers stopped, then resumed. There was a moment during the cross-examination, and this is the moment that the Charleston Gazette reporter would describe in his article the following day, the moment that the people in the gallery would talk about for years afterward, when Pratt asked Lenora whether she could identify by name the 3 miners who had survived the shift in shaft number 7 on the day Declan died. She could. She knew their names. She had gone to their houses. She had stood at their doors and asked them to speak, but she did not give their names. I will not make witnesses of men who have already paid enough, she said. They are miners with families. They live in company houses. They buy their food from the company store with company scrip. If I speak their names in this courtroom, they will lose their jobs by morning and their homes by the end of the week. They are not the criminals in this room, they are the frightened, and I will not add my name to the list of people who have used their fear against them. Judge Fenton looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Braddock, who was sitting behind his attorneys with the first visible crack in his composure, a tightening of the jaw, a slight forward lean, the posture of a man who is beginning to understand that the ground has shifted beneath him. The court notes the witness's position, Fenton said, and then he called for additional testimony. Pete Farley took the stand. He described the night his brother died, the 2 men leaving the cabin at midnight, the face of Doss in the moonlight, the sound of the creek, the coroner's ruling of accidental death. He described 5 years of silence. He described Doss sitting on his porch, cleaning his fingernails with a knife, saying, "Nice place you got here, Pete." His voice was rough and unsteady, the voice of a man pulling stones out of his own chest one at a time, but he did not stop. Harlan Rawls took the stand. He presented the notarized copies of the Montrose documents made in Richmond, Virginia in 1925, 6 years before Lenora Ashwick ever set foot in Stone Hollow. He described his meeting with Simon Montrose. He described his years of carrying the copies. He described his connection to Declan Ashwick, the Argonne Forest, 1918 3rd Battalion, the trench, the mud, the shell, and the hand that reached down and pulled him out. The gallery was motionless, the reporters wrote without looking up, the deacons sat with their hands folded. And Aldrich Braddock, behind his wall of lawyers, had stopped looking composed and started looking like what he was, a man sitting inside a structure that was coming apart around him, beam by beam, brick by brick, nail by nail. And then it happened. Thaddeus Hale, the lead attorney, the man who had opened the defense with his smooth, compassionate motion to dismiss Lenora's testimony, the man who had served Aldrich Braddock for 20 years and who had built the legal architecture of every fraudulent transfer, every fabricated debt, every silenced witness, stood up. He did not stand the way a lawyer stands when he is about to make an objection. He stood the way a man stands when he has been sitting for a very long time and his body cannot bear the weight of sitting any longer, slowly. With the deliberateness of someone performing an action that cannot be undone, the courtroom noticed, the gallery shifted. Pratt, the second attorney, turned to look at Hale with an expression of confusion that quickly became alarm. Braddock leaned forward. Hale walked to the center of the courtroom. He faced Judge Fenton, and he spoke in a voice that the people present would later describe in different ways. Some said it was steady, some said it was broken, some said it was the voice of a man waking up from a very long sleep, but that everyone agreed was the voice of someone who had reached the end of something. Your Honor, he said, I cannot continue this defense. The courtroom did not react immediately. There is a delay between the moment when words are spoken and the moment when their meaning arrives, like the gap between lightning and thunder, and in that gap the room held its breath. I have served as legal counsel to Aldrich Braddock for 20 years, Haley continued. During that time, I personally drafted the transfer documents for 14 of the 17 property seizures described in the Montrose Confession. I certified debts that did not exist. I prepared filings for the county court that I knew to be fraudulent. I was present in the counting house on multiple occasions when the dual bookkeeping system described by the deceased Mr. Ashwick was in active use. And I have in my possession in a locked file at my office in Braddock Hollow 20 years of correspondence, memoranda, and internal records that corroborate every claim made by Mrs. Ashwick in her testimony today. He paused. The stenographer's hands had stopped. I say this, Hale said, because if I do not, I will die carrying this weight on my soul. The words hung in the courtroom like smoke, and everyone who had listened to Lenora's presentation of the Montrose documents recognized them because they were the same words that Simon Montrose had written at the beginning of his confession 20 years earlier in a cellar beneath a prayer room before he sealed his truth in a box and waited for someone brave enough to open it. Halley had read those words. He had read them because he had been there when Braddock took the Montrose lands. He had drafted the documents. He had helped build the cage. And now, standing in a federal courtroom in Charleston with the cage open and the evidence laid bare, he had heard his own crime described in words, written by the man he had helped to destroy, and something in him, something that had been locked and buried for 20 years. The way the documents had been locked and buried in the cellar had broken open. The courtroom erupted. Braddock rose from his chair. His face, the composed, silver-haired, blue-eyed face that had graced the front pages and the charity dinners and the church dedications, was no longer composed. It was the face of a man watching his own monument collapse from the inside, and what showed through the cracks was not fear, not yet, but fury. The fury of a man who has been betrayed by the one person he trusted to keep his secrets. He said something. The stenographer recorded it as an incoherent objection and moved toward the side door of the courtroom with the quick, purposeful stride of a man who has decided that departure is preferable to exposure. The two federal marshals positioned at the side door, the ones that Judge Fenton had placed there as a precaution, the precaution that Lenora had not appreciated at the time, stepped forward and blocked his path. Braddock stopped, looked at the marshals, looked at the judge, And in that look, something finished. The last act of a play that had been running for 20 years, performed before an audience that had finally stopped applauding. The hearing concluded that afternoon. The formal verdict came 4 days later after Fenton had reviewed Hale's files, which were delivered to the courthouse by federal marshals who drove to Braddock Hollow and retrieved them from Hale's office while Sheriff Cyrus Keel stood on the porch and watched with the expression of a man who knows that the structure he has been leaning against has just been condemned. Guilty. All charges: fraud, falsification, theft, conspiracy, accessory to wrongful death. Aldrich Braddock's assets were seized by federal order. His properties, the mines, the company store, the houses, the roads, the land were placed under receivership pending redistribution. Wallace Greer, the county clerk, was arrested at his home and charged separately. Sheriff Cyrus Keel was suspended from duty and placed under investigation for obstruction of justice and complicity in the death of Emmett Farley. The county coroner was subpoenaed to explain his rulings in the deaths of Declan Ashwick and Emmett Farley. And the land began to come back. Martha Shelton's 40 acres of bottomland were identified in the Montrose documents and placed on the restitution docket. Pete Farley's family land seized after Emmett's death in a death that Pete now proved was fabricated entered the same process. 15 other families named in the list began filing claims with the federal court, each one carrying a copy of the Montrose Confession and the list of names, each one walking into the courthouse with the dazed expression of people who have been told that a door they believed was permanently locked has been standing open the entire time. Not all the claims would succeed. The legal process was slow, and some families had been scattered so thoroughly by years of dispossession that they could not be found. The system that had enabled Braddock was not dismantled by a single verdict. Systems never are. But the wall had been breached, the precedent had been set, and in the hollows and the ridge towns and the coal camps of eastern Kentucky, people were talking, not in whispers, not in the low voices of the frightened, in the voices of people who had just learned that speaking was possible. Lenora Ashwick's testimony was reported in the Charleston Gazette and picked up by papers in Lexington, Louisville, and eventually Richmond, where a retired newspaper editor read the account and recognized the name Montrose and called Harlan Rawls to say that he was sorry. He had killed the story in 1925 and that he supposed some stories just need to wait for the right person to tell them. Spring came to the hollow, the way spring always comes to Appalachia, without asking permission, without giving much warning, arriving in the dogwood blossoms on the ridge and the redbud trees along the creek and the wild crab apple on the south slope above Stone Hollow, which bloomed white in late March before the cold was fully gone. Lenora saw it from the courtyard. The courtyard that was no longer the ivy-choked, leaf-rotted space she had entered 5 months ago, but a clean, ordered yard with the well repaired and the stones leveled and a young apple tree planted by Clementine against the south wall in January, already pushing out its first tight green buds. The roof of the main room was repaired, not with the materials that a wealthy man would use, but with the materials of a woman who works with what she has: oak beams pulled from the hickory grove by the creek, cut and shaped with a borrowed saw, raised into place with the help of a carpenter from the settlement named Oakes, who had come to offer his labor as a gift, not a contract, because his family was one of the 17 on the list, and his father had lost 80 acres to a Braddock debt in 1919, and the land was coming back. Others came too, not all who might have come. The fear that Braddock had cultivated for 20 years did not evaporate in a single season. Many people in the hollow and the surrounding hills preferred to wait and watch before committing themselves to the woman at Stone Hollow, because caution is the survival instinct of people who have been burned, and it does not release its grip easily. But some came. The miller from the settlement who began bringing flour every 2 weeks in exchange for the use of the road that crossed Lenora's land to the rail junction. A farming family from Millstone Gap who worked one of the adjacent fields on a share arrangement. Martha Shelton, who came every week and stayed sometimes for days, teaching Clementine the patterns of Appalachian weaving on a loom that had belonged to Martha's mother and her mother before that, patterns with names like wig rose and chariot wheel and snail trail, patterns that encoded the history of a people in thread and color the way the Montrose documents encoded the history of a crime in ink and wax. Pete Farley came with his wife and children driving the Model T that Harlan had left with him when Harlan returned to Richmond after the trial. Pete's land was in the restitution process, but it would take months, and in the meantime, he worked the fields near Stone Hollow with the steady, grateful energy of a man who has set down a 5-year burden and discovered that his back still works. Lenora sent a letter to Harlan Rawls in Richmond. It was short, 2 sentences of thanks, and an accounting of the expenses he had incurred during the journey to Charleston, the gasoline, the boarding house, the food which she intended to repay in installments over the following years. She was not a woman who carried debts comfortably, even debts owed to friends. Harlan's reply was shorter: save it for the school. The school was Clementine's idea, which was Lenora's idea, which was the idea that arises naturally in anyone who has had to learn to read in order to survive and who knows what it costs when no one teaches you. A room in the prayer room at Stone Hollow, the same prayer room where the cellar had been found, the same room whose rose window Clementine had cleared of trumpet vine in October, and whose stone walls now admitted a clean southern light that fell across the floor in patterns that changed with the hour and the season. A room where the children of the hollow, the miners' children, the farmers' children, the children of the 17 families, and the families who came after could learn to read and write and count. It was not a school yet, it was an intention. A few salvaged books, a slate board that Oakes, the carpenter, had made from a slab of smooth limestone, and the will of Clementine Ashwick, who at 14 had handwriting cleaner than half the clerks in the county, and who had learned in the space of 5 months that literacy was not a skill but a weapon, the weapon that had saved her mother's life and her father's memory and the land beneath their feet. But the things that begin this way, small and finished, held together by will rather than resources, are the things that last. The great institutions of the world were all at some point a single room with a single teacher and a handful of students who did not yet know what they would become. In late March, a letter arrived at Stone Hollow bearing the seal of the First Methodist Church of Braddock Hollow. It was not a letter of gratitude, though gratitude was present in it. It was a proposal. The church, which had recovered its communion vessels and whose position in the ongoing proceedings against Braddock's state was strong, thanks to the evidence Lenora had preserved, offered its formal support for the school at Stone Hollow. Books, writing materials, the periodic visit of a church teacher to train the volunteer instructors. Not money. Money was scarce everywhere in 1932, but something more valuable in the structure of Appalachian community life: institutional backing, the endorsement of an organization that people trusted in a place where trust had been systematically destroyed for 20 years and was only now slowly and painfully being rebuilt. Lenora read the letter twice, then she set it on the table and walked out to the courtyard. It was the late afternoon of a March day. The wind from the north still carried cold, but the cutting edge of winter was gone, replaced by something softer, not warm yet, but no longer hostile, the way a stranger becomes an acquaintance and then over time and shared experience something closer. The wild crab apple on the south slope was visible from the wall of the station, white blossoms against the dark green of the hickory grove and the brown of the creek bank where the last of the winter mud was drying in the lengthening days. In the field to the north, Pete Farley and his eldest boy were working the soil with a borrowed mule, turning the earth for the first spring planting. In the prayer room, Clementine's voice carried on the wind. She was teaching letters to Martha Shelton's granddaughter, a girl of 12, who had never held a pencil before and who was learning with the noisy enthusiasm of someone discovering that the world contains doors she did not know existed. Lenora leaned her arms on the stone wall and looked at the hollow. 5 months ago she was a woman without a roof, without land, without money, with a daughter and a bread knife and a fear that filled her chest like water filling a well. She had bought a ruin with 12 silver dollars and the neighbors had laughed. They had been right about one thing. It was madness. It was madness to stay when the logic of the world said there was nothing to be done. It was madness to descend into a dark cellar with a homemade torch and a rage that had burned away everything inside her except itself. It was madness to refuse safe passage to Richmond when the road was open and the danger was real. It was madness to sit in a federal courtroom and speak for 2 hours against the man who owned the mines and the sheriff and the church and the county clerk and every lever of power in a 100-mile radius. But madness of a certain kind is not madness at all. It is what the reasonable call determination before they understand it. It is what the comfortable call foolishness before they need it. It is the thing that lives in the marrow of people who have lost everything and who discover in the losing that the thing they thought they had lost, safety, security, the approval of their neighbors, was never the thing that mattered. What mattered was the thing that could not be taken, the thing that Declan had carried into the trenches of the Argonne and into the darkness of shaft number 7, the thing that Simon Montrose had sealed in a box in a cellar beneath a prayer room, knowing that someday someone would come who was stubborn enough or desperate enough or angry enough to open it. The bell at the settlement church rang the evening hour, that slow-spaced tolling that marks the end of the working day and the beginning of the quiet hour before dark. In the field, Pete and his boy unyoked the mule. In the prayer room, Clementine's voice paused and then resumed in a different tone, the tone of someone ending a lesson and beginning to tidy up, the small domestic sounds of chairs being moved and a slate being wiped clean. Lenora stayed on the wall a moment longer. The creek ran through the hickory grove with its permanent murmur, the same water that had run in Simon Montrose's time and would run when Clementine was an old woman and the children of the prayer room school were grown with stories of their own. The wind picked up slightly and the crab apple blossoms trembled on the south slope, and Lenora Ashwick, widow landowner, witness survivor, and the woman the neighbors had laughed at in October, allowed herself a thing she had not allowed in months. She breathed, not the shallow, guarded breathing of fear, not the held breath of waiting, not the sharp intake before a blow, just breathing. The ordinary, unremarkable act of drawing air into lungs and letting it go, which is the simplest thing a living person does and which becomes, after months of not doing it fully, the most profound. The light shifted on the hollow, the shadows lengthened, and the walls of stone hollow limestone, 18 inches thick, built in 1887 by men who intended them to last, stood in the fading afternoon the way they had always stood and the way they would stand long after the last coal was pulled from these mountains and the last company store closed its doors, and the name Aldrich Braddock was forgotten by everyone except the families who remembered what he had taken and the woman who had taken it back. The neighbors had laughed when the widow bought the ruins. They stopped laughing when the storms came, and the walls held.